So welcome to those of you who are watching. Thanks so much for watching the video. My name is Joy Morin and I am a piano teacher in Ohio and a blogger at colorinmypiano.com, which is a place where we talk about effective and engaging piano teaching. It's a fun place to be. So in today's video, I would like to talk a little bit about our eye gaze during piano playing and just this aspect of it. So when we're at the piano, what are our eyes doing? Where is our gaze? So in last week's video, we talked a little bit about knowing when to move on to a new piece of music with piano students. And during the course of our discussion, we talked a little bit about this idea that to develop students into, let's say, better sight readers, then we want to give them many opportunities to sight read, and then they will, gradually become better at sight reading. The same is true for any skill. So if you want your students to become better memorizers, then we need to make sure that they have many opportunities to memorize music and perform from memory. While this is definitely a true concept, I think, that we want to provide these many opportunities for students to be learning through those activities, it's also true that there are specific strategies that we can impart to our students to help improve their skills in certain areas. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of our eyes and our gaze during specific activities at the piano. So as kind of a challenge after today's video, maybe you can think about, especially if you haven't before, see if you can watch your students gaze while they're playing and see if that impacts and gives you insight into the students' thinking during that activity. So there are basically two places, I think, where our gaze tends to go when we're playing the piano. Either we're looking up at the music or we're looking down at our hands on the keyboard. I don't think either one is inherently desirable or bad or anything like that, but I do think each has their place depending on the activity that we're doing at the piano. So first, let's talk about having our eyes up on the page. So some situations where we would want our eyes to stay on the page would be when we are sight reading music for the first time, certainly, but I think also any time afterwards that we're reading the music as opposed to playing it from our memory, we're making it up from our head. So when we observe a student not sight reading well, they are often tending to glance down at their hands very frequently. This means that mentally they're having to keep track of the notes up on the page as well as what their hands are doing at the keyboard at the same time. So their mental energy is sort of split between the two. Good sight readers, on the other hand, tend to keep their eyes focused up on the page and they trust their hands to find the right keys as they play. So when we see a student with their gaze split between the page and their hands, what do we do about this? I think first we can have a discussion about it so that they bring it into their awareness. I think of the first step of any type of learning, no matter what it is, the first step is always awareness. So we can communicate to our students that we've observed their eyes going back and forth between the music and their hands, and then let them know why this is kind of an inefficient strategy when they're sight reading or reading music. It's too much for us to try to keep track of everything on the page, especially when it is the first time that we're seeing the music, as well as keeping track of their hands. We want our eyes to stay on the page so that we can take advantage, of all the information that is there on the page to help us as we're sight reading, and to be more accurate and to keep time, to keep rhythm as we're playing. So we have to develop this sense of being able to feel the keys and trust that all the keys are there and trust our hands that they're going to know what they need to do. Of course, I don't think we would necessarily want our eyes to never look at our hands when we're reading music. I don't think that's true. But there are occasions where there might be a leap in the music, or we have to move across the keyboard for a distance. So we may need to take our eyes and to look at the keys to help us with that sort of situation. But as a general rule, it's probably a good guideline that our eyes need to stay on the page as much as possible so that we can gather as much information from the sheet music as we can as we sight read. So once this is brought into the student's awareness, they can think about where their eyes are as they're sight reading. Then we can also then state the goal to the students, I think, in two ways, this idea of where the eyes go. So we could state it as a negative, which would be, don't look at your hands. This kind of directive can work very well for some students, or it could completely backfire. If you can think of situations where someone says to you, don't look over there, what of course are you going to do? Or if you say, don't think about this, inevitably that's what we do. We do what we were told not to do. So sometimes stating it as more of a positive goal for what you should do and rather than what you should not do can be more effective for students. So to state this goal positively, we could say, keep your eyes glued to the page. Or I also really like to say this. Imagine that you have laser vision and that you're going to zap every note on the page as you read the music. But you don't want to look down and end up accidentally zapping your hands if you can avoid it. So this is kind of a fun, imaginative way to think about this goal of trying to keep the eyes up on the music, and students usually like this quite a bit. So now the issue is in the students' awareness. They also have this positive strategy and goal that they're thinking about as they sight read. Now we could ask them to sight read again and to see if there's a difference when they have this strategy in play versus the first time when their eyes and their attention was constantly being diverted between the music and their hands. But we can go further, and there's other activities that are commonly used during sight reading that we can use. One example would be covering the student's hands. So you could take a book or a sheet of music and place it, just hold it up over the student's hands so that as they're playing, they cannot see their hands, and they know that paper is there, so they're less likely to even try. But if they did try, the paper would be blocking their view. So that's a very common approach that I'm sure you've been exposed to, perhaps when you were a young piano student, to develop sight reading skills. Another activity would be to cover the sheet music, maybe with an index card or another piece of paper, to cover the sheet music as the student is playing and gradually follow. And then gradually with the piece of paper you can cover first just the notes that the student is done playing, but eventually move it forward so that you're gradually covering even the notes that the student is currently playing, and you're getting ahead of where the student is playing. And what this does is force the student to look ahead. There have been research studies that suggest that good sight readers always look ahead. So I think this is a valuable activity to experiment with. I've also heard of a study that has been done showing that good sight readers also tend to look behind where they are and not just ahead, so that they can see the score as a whole, and perhaps they're comparing what has already happened to what's coming ahead, or maybe they're using the past to predict what might be coming up in the sheet music coming up. So I think that's something to keep in mind too, that these types of activities can be useful, but it might not be the end-all solution. So I'll briefly mention one other thing in connection with sight reading here, even though it isn't directly related to this idea of where our eyes go during sight reading. I think it's still relevant nonetheless. So many piano students, when they're sight reading, and myself too, when we sight read, we sometimes tend to stop and go, particularly if we make a mistake or if we think we're about to make a mistake. But there are many practical situations for a musician where they need to be able to keep going even through mistakes. So when we are sight reading, or if we have a student sight reading for us during a lesson, we can verbally tell them, keep going, don't stop, don't stop. But those verbal reminders don't always help, and the student still feels stuck maybe and still wants to stop for a mistake or to fix the mistake. So a possible solution to this would be sight reading duets. So if you can get your hands on a few books of easy teacher-student duets and you can sight read those together, this very often helps the student feel more like a team, and that you're feeling the beat together, and it feels a lot harder for the student to think about stopping the train, kind of. They feel like they have to keep going because they've got someone sitting right next to them playing along with them and keeping the beat. So those are a few ideas about keeping the eyes on the page, and when those circumstances are that we would want the eyes to be on the page, and what we can do when that doesn't happen. So let's turn and talk a little bit about the opposite. So what about when the eyes should or could be down at looking at our hands or the keyboard as we're playing? So situations where this would be the goal would be if you are learning a piece of music by ear, or if you are learning the piece by rote, so someone is visually showing you. Usually you're also using your ear in those situations too. That's a topic I would love to talk more about, I think, in a future video, but I think what I'm going to focus on today in this connection is this example of the transition where a student's been reading and playing a piece of music, where they're seeing the music, but then transitioning to the point where they want to memorize the music and ultimately be able to perform the piece totally from memory. So in this situation, once the score is gone and the student is expected to play by memory, they're no longer able, of course, to have their eyes on the music. So where should their eyes go? What should they be doing? So one of the first things I tell a student if I'm asking them to memorize a piece of music is to try to watch their hands as much as possible. And only look at up at the score if they absolutely have to. So the idea here would be to gradually wean yourself off of the score. And I think this is what we all typically naturally do when we're trying to memorize music. But to help students strategize if they're memorizing maybe for the first time, to have them think about where their eyes are, I think can be helpful. So I like to tell students, imagine that you're trying to form a visual memory of your hands and the keys playing the piece of music, almost like watching a video, except that you're the one directing the action in the movie. So when we no longer have this score at our disposal, I think this is when we can really consciously, visually depend on the keyboard instead. So again, this is where the students have the goal in their awareness. They have a strategy in place that they can use as they're memorizing. But then there are other activities we can do that can help and kind of force this along. So one idea is to take the music off of the music rack and to set it somewhere where it's a little harder to look at. So for example, I like to very often take my music and set it on the floor next to my bench so that I would have to turn over and look down to see the music. Or if you want to make it even more challenging, you can take your book and set it across the room so that then I would have to stand up, walk across the room, take a look at where I got stuck in the music, remember it, and come back and be able to get through that area. That's very challenging, but it's a great way to practice, to really make sure that you're not just easily looking at the music without thinking when you're really trying to be memorizing the music. So there's a lot more about memorizing music that we could talk about here. There's so much more to it than just the visual aspect. So if this sounds like kind of an oversimplification, that's because it is. I think the same is true with music reading and understanding the music as well. There's so much more to it that we could talk about than just this visual aspect. But that's the only part I wanted to talk about today, is just thinking about where our gaze goes naturally. And with different students it's going to be different. And then to think about where our gaze should ideally be, depending on what the activity is. So all of this, I think, is a balance. As we said at the beginning, I don't think any particular way is always the goal. We don't always want our eyes on the music, we don't always want our eyes on the keyboard, but to figure out what that balance is, I think, is important, because that can help us be more successful in developing certain skills. So just to kind of summarize and wrap this up, I'll just emphasize again that I think it's important for students to be able to do both. And it's important for us as teachers to be able to pay attention to what's happening, especially if the student is unaware of their gaze during these piano playing activities, so that we can help them develop these strategies to be successful. To take this back for a moment to a beginner piano student, let's suppose, who's working their way through a piano method book. I think the idea is for our students to learn ideally through a really healthy mix of reading and rote learning. So in fact, when a student is learning a given piece in a piano method, the ideal would be for a student to be able to play the piece two ways. They can play the piece from beginning to end with their eyes pretty much always staying on the page, and it would be great also for the student to be able to play the piece all the way through from memory. Being able to do both is, I think, the ideal, because if a student only can play the piece fluently by memory, and then if they get stuck somewhere, they're forced to stop and they can't find where they are in the score, those are all indicators showing that some aspect of it is missing. So for the student to be able to do both shows that they have strengths in both areas. So this is again where the teacher's expertise is especially important, for us to be able to know when to do what with the student. When do we give the student an assignment, to memorize a piece or to sight read certain pieces, to improve on their skills, whatever we sense might be lacking. but we also want to be able to give assignments that capitalize on whatever their strengths are. So, some students might find playing by rote or playing by ear is very easy for them, and then perhaps sight reading is difficult, and part of that might be because they tend to always want to be aware of what their hands are doing at the keyboard. So then you would want to be aware of that. You want to capitalize on those strengths and continue to help the student become an even better player by ear, but also helping the student realize that they could become a very good sight reader too, and part of it is related to where their eyes tend to want to go. So this is part of our role as a teacher, I think, to pay attention to the student's gaze during these activities so that we can help them strategize and improve their skills. So that's my challenge for today. I just wanted to share some of the things that I've been rolling around in my mind and thinking about this week in connection with last week's video, and kind of following up on this idea of helping students become better sight readers or memorizers or whatever that skill might be. So if you have comments on this video, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. So please feel free to leave a comment on my blog, colorinmypiano.com. I'd love to hear your comments or reactions with what you've noticed about your students' gaze when they're playing the piano, and whatever the goal might be at that time. Thanks again for watching. I hope you'll consider joining again next week, Monday at noon Eastern Time. Please feel free also to visit colorinmypiano.com/live, which is a place where you'll find a special page with all the previous broadcasts so far. And there's also a link there where you can send me your questions and ideas for future videos. Again, that page is colorinmypiano.com/live. I would really love to have your input. Thanks again for watching. Happy teaching.